I'm Sarah. I'm a postdoc at Princeton. I'm a cryptographer first and sort of a legally interested cryptographer second. And so today, hopefully, you've been hearing about the sort of standard setting of content moderation from many different people, and we're going to continue hearing that from many different people. But I want to talk about content moderation in end-to-end encryption, which is also one of the current Flashpoint controversial arguments. Okay, so just about anything you do on the internet these days has some form of encryption in it. This is sort of the standard encrypted setting where I am sending some content via a platform to some other person. And although that information is encrypted in transit, so defended against network attackers, in the standard encrypted setting, the platform also has the keys to read that material, whereas in end-to-end encryption, the platform does not even have the keys necessary to read that content. And just for the sake of this talk, you do also get the defense against network attackers, but to make the slides a little nicer with fewer boxes, I'm just going to focus on the fact that the platform, at least naively, does not have access to what the content is. They might know something about the content. Maybe they know who posted it, or how big it is, or what type of thing it is, but they can't view the content itself. And this is used in many settings already, and it is used in a growing number of settings. So text chat is probably the most well-known, but also email end-to-end encryption has been around for a long time. There is video end-to-end encryption that you can enable in Zoom, file sharing, all sorts of things. I would even argue that most people's normal internet browsing has some kind of end-to-end encryption on it if you consider, your computer and the web server to be the ends rather than, whereas the intermediate routers or ISPs can't necessarily see what you're doing. And I think, as we continue on in society, we're going to get more and more different sorts of things end-to-end encrypted, more social medias, different forms of that also being end-to-end encrypted. So I think you have to confront the question of end-to-end encryption and content moderation in the same setting. There is currently a lot of controversy in content moderation and end-to-end encryption. The current controversy is mostly about CSAM, or child sexual abuse material. Apple created a detection feature that was going to, in a mostly privacy-preserving way, detect whether images uploaded to iCloud Photos were matched a CSAM database in a similar sort of matchlist scenario as the GIF-CT that Gavin was talking about. That was sort of delayed for at least the foreseeable future. But I also want to add that this is the newest form of that question going on, but it is certainly not the first form of content moderation in end-to-end encryption that we've had to deal with. It is not going to be the last, and I want to take a step back and in this talk not only about CSAM, but also about all the other things that one might want to have some kind of content moderation capabilities for in end-to-end encryption. And we will also get into why this is sort of more challenging. Okay, I'm going to zoom through the parts of content moderation systems that are the most relevant to the cryptography question. I'm going to spend a lot of time on the current cryptography literature on what you can do to do content moderation in end-to-end encryption. I'm going to talk about some sort of gaps in those approaches and issues with those approaches, and we'll finish hopefully on a positive note because there is so much work to be done in this area from a social science perspective, from a cryptography perspective, all sorts of things. So I used to spend a lot more time in this talk doing this, but I don't have very much time, so I'm just going to zoom through it really quickly. For the most part, content moderation, once you have a system in place, you're mostly talking about some kind of detection mechanism and some sort of response. So the detection mechanism might be a match list, or it might be something that involves context around when the content was sent. Is it a high volume of content? Was the sender, somebody affiliated with an organization that is not allowed to post? All sorts of things. Once that content has been detected to be whatever that category is of things that that the platform does not want to allow to be sent, some kind of response is done. And a lot of attention is paid to just sort of, do we ban it or do we not ban it? There are a whole host of other things besides banning that you could do. You can demote it, you can prevent the user from getting money from it, you can, all sorts of different things like this. You can lower the person's reputation, you can show it but with a warning or something like that. So, many different kinds of responses that you can do. And you might even, send it back to get a higher granularity of detection as well, right? So a common paradigm is to have a first layer of AI to detect, things that we think might be bad, and then if the AI says, I think it might be bad, but I'm not sure, it gets promoted to a human moderator or something like that. In end-to-end encryption, we imagine that, we mostly want the detection and maybe also the response to take place without the platform's knowledge. At the very least, and I'll get into the exact definition of what I want in a second, but at the very least, the platform, hopefully won't learn anything about non-matches. So hopefully the platform won't learn anything about content that was, quote, good and not bad. And so there is this additional layer of transparency, which normally means, public transparency, auditability, et cetera. But what I want to talk about here is also like, what does the platform learn about the detection or non-detection that just took place? What does the sender learn about whether or not they had their content moderated? What does the receiver learn about whether they would have seen some content, but it's been removed because it violated TOS? And hopefully you want to take all of that information that you learn and put it into a sort of evaluation and improvement process where over time, if you're a platform and you have a content moderation system, hopefully you want to improve that content moderation system. And you want to make a better detector, or you want to hone the responses that you might give, or even, maybe you need to make a change to your terms of service. So zoomed through that, but we're going to use this for the rest of the time. So I want to spend most of my time on the current literature in cryptography for content moderation that happens under end-to-end encryption. And this is almost entirely focused on detecting content in end-to-end encryption, and a little bit of work on sort of like what are your options for responding to that. I would be very irresponsible if I did not mention that this research is very new. There are a lot of policy issues, there are a lot of technical issues. This is a controversial topic even within sort of the academic cryptography space, let alone outside the academic cryptography space. And what I'm going to be talking about today is sort of technical capabilities and only some description of policy issues, which you are already also talking about in standard content moderation. I will do a shameless plug that we also have a poster on a different work that digs more into the policy issues that we will show, my co-author Anane will show on content moderation, sort of policy issues under end-to-end encryption tomorrow. Okay, so in addition to having whatever goals we want to have for the content moderation, where we want it to have a low false positive rate and a low false negative rate and all this stuff, we also have privacy goals when we're trying to do this detection under end-to-end encryption. And the biggest thing there is client privacy, meaning we were in an end-to-end encrypted system. The sort of gold standard goal that you would want to go for is the same privacy guarantees that you already had in end-to-end encryption. And then there is a sort of different proposal for what like sort of a partial client privacy system might look like, which is to say, if somebody sends a non-problematic message, then you have the same privacy guarantees as end-to-end encryption. If somebody sends a problematic message, maybe we're okay with losing some privacy in that case. So for instance, the image might get revealed to the server. This would be partial client privacy. But only, I should add, if it matches some kind of either list or model, and I'll talk about what that would be. There is a separate goal of server privacy. This is commonly talked about in the CSAM use case because there's sort of a worry that if there's like a CSAM match list, or actually I think the same issues would arise with the GIF-CT, there's sort of a worry that clients would be able to like test their images against, okay, like I'll just see if it's in this database, and if it is in this database, I won't send it because I know I'll get in trouble. If it's not in this database, then I know I can send it with no problem. So sometimes there is also an interest in hiding the list from the clients. So the server wants privacy on the list. Again, not always applicable. If it's like a profanity filter, maybe you don't care. Okay, and the other sort of big question when you're designing a content moderation system for end-to-end encryption is who is notified when detection happens. So a notification that some kind of detection has occurred is already a response that is one of the things that you might like do in response to detecting something. If you're just informing the receiver and the sender, there's not that much of an end-to-end encryption impact. There might be a little, but you're already sort of keeping the information gained to just the ends of the communication, which is sort of in keeping with the principles of E2EE. So for example, if somebody, if a message got a warning attached to it, but the server had no idea whether or not it attached to a warning to any specific message, but the receiver found out, that's at least like, the server didn't learn anything new. You could imagine a system where, as all these thousands and millions of messages are being sent, some aggregate data is collected, hopefully in a privacy-preserving way, that might reveal, the total number of detections or something. If you do that right using privacy tools, that should have a pretty low impact on the end-to-end encryption as well. If you're at the point where you're saying, I'm going to report the detection to a human moderator or the platform or a third party, you're now sort of leaving the realm of normal end-to-end encryption, and now you're entering the realm of like end-to-end encryption asterisk, except for whatever the category is of stuff we're detecting. And one point I want to make is that for the most part, you could inform any subset of these parties using any of the detection mechanisms that I'm going to describe. It is easier or harder to do that for some of these, but it's sort of a mostly orthogonal design choice who you want to inform of a detection. I'm going to talk about 3 detection paradigms that are all content-based, I should have added. So these are not including things like metadata analysis, traffic analysis, that sort of thing. I'm mostly just focusing on things that use content or use content in addition to other things. So for the most part, we basically have matchlists, machine learning, and human moderation. And I'll talk a little bit about each of these. Okay, so first we have matchlists. We just had a great example with the GIF-CT, so I won't dwell on this. Basically, you flag content if it matches some predefined list, or if it close to matches a predefined list. And the pros of this are you're not going to, the false positive rate is going to be lower than if you were using AI, like probably. Right, so you're matching against a list of known stuff, so you're pretty unlikely to have this match something that, just your AI kind of messed up. But you already, of course, have to know what the things are that you're looking for, so you aren't going to have a good time detecting new stuff. And this is the tool that definitely relies heavily on these perceptual hash functions to avoid trivial evasion. So here's the perceptual hash function discussion that you've all been waiting for like 2 hours or something. So a perceptual hash function is a special kind of hash function where we have tried to make the hash function return the same hash for 2 different images. So, and you have to predefine what the class of changes are that you're going to try to make the same hash return for. So for example, perceptual hash functions might try to have a rotation of an image return the same hash, which would not be true, for example, cryptographic hash functions, which is like a different kind of hash function. So we might try to, make these 2 images on the left have the same hash function, or these images, the same hash, excuse me, or these images on the right have the same hash. There are a number of these different hash functions out there. Facebook has one, Apple has one, Microsoft has one. There are a bunch in, sort of research land. There has recently been some work sort of criticizing them for having either the ability to partially invert the hash. So for example, that would mean that the database that Gavin was talking about might have some content after all, because maybe you can partially reconstruct the images that are in there. There is a lot of research on inducing collisions or inducing non-collisions. There's a whole bunch of links at the bottom for people who have done this. You can kind of see the reason this exists is to try to prevent people from, sort of trivially getting around the match list by saying, oh, I'm just going to change the top left pixel to a black pixel, and then it'll have a different hash, and so it won't get detected. The purpose of this is to avoid this. But of course, in the standard security cat and mouse game, if you start doing this, then people will say, oh, well, you can detect rotations and watermarks, so I'll just, do something, I'll flip it, or I'll, maybe they do flipping too, I don't know. There'll be a evolution of techniques that are trying to just stay barely ahead of whatever the detection mechanism is, and the detection mechanism will try to stay barely ahead of whatever people are doing to evade it. And in some sense, good luck.
What exactly is an induced collision?
So by an induced collision, what I mean is it I guess what I would call a non-induced collision, like a natural collision, is a collision that would just sort of happen with a natural distribution of images that somebody is sending. Meaning, I just so happened to send a completely unrelated image of like a flower, and the natural action of, the naive action of the hash function was to, there was sort of an accidental collision. An induced collision would be the opposite, where I deliberately try to manipulate my image in a specific way to make the images have the same hash. And there are well-known ways to do this for machine learning. There are well-known ways to do this, or mostly well-known ways to do this for perceptual hash functions. You could not do this with a cryptographic hash function. Like, the point of a cryptographic hash function is it is very computationally hard to cause collisions. But with a perceptual hash function, it becomes easier to sort of take two unrelated images, like a cat and a flower, and add some very carefully chosen noise, so that now all of a sudden they hash to the same thing. I can talk more about that after the break. But the reason that this is important is, if a targeted investigation was being done to somebody, one knew a hash that would cause the detector to go off, one could plant an innocuous-looking image on somebody's phone that had a hash that matched something on a hash database, is why this is an important thing to think about. Okay, so under Matchlists, there are sort of three-ish technical ways you could go about implementing a match list under end-to-end encryption. One of them is you have the match list on the server, and you do some complicated kinds of encryption to to keep the image encrypted, but basically use special cryptography, so either private set intersection or private information retrieval or some other things, to cause matches to be detected on the server. You could also do a version of this where the platform just obliviously changes the encryption without knowing whether or not a match occurred, and it is then given all the way onto the receiver, and the receiver has the cryptographic information able to learn whether or not there was a match or a non-match. And the other thing that people try to do in end-to-end encryption is just shove the entire thing onto the client side, where the client gets some kind of version of the match list on their phone, and the client is the one that just checks, on the unencrypted image, whether or not there's a match or a non-match. This is highly controversial, and I will talk about that in a little bit. Let me talk about match lists in the cryptography literature. The first thing I want to point out is I think match lists are actually, for content moderation, are older than people think. The two ones that people talk about for content moderation are these two from 2021. This one is the Apple proposal that was delayed. And this other one was a paper at Usenix last year. But I actually want to propose that this is sort of, the similar idea has been around for things like malware detection for a little bit more time. But the difference maybe is that these things will notify the client rather than the server, right? So this is getting back to that point I was saying before about, you know, the CSAM ones were sort of made to report to a server when a detection was made, rather than reporting to a client device when a detection was made. You'll also notice that the false positive rate of the two that I've circled are completely based on a perceptual hash function, the sort of collision rate of a perceptual hash function, as opposed to these other ones, which use cryptographic hashes, and therefore don't really have this problem, but also wouldn't be terribly usable for images for the same reason. I am happy to answer more about any of these individual ones later, but I have a lot to get through, so I'm going to keep going. You can then have the same sorts of questions for machine learning instead of a match list, right? So classification. I guess a simple example would just be something like nudity detection. It's also been proposed for CSAM. It's also been proposed for, you know, trying to build a classifier that will distinguish, you know, for instance, terrorist or violent extremist content. I guarantee you, like, any category of content moderation, and it's been proposed to have some kind of AI-based detection of it. And the pros are obvious because you can detect, you know, stuff you haven't seen before. But the cons are also that, you know, you inevitably have a higher false positive rate. And if I had written this talk 3 years ago, every single person here would have been giving a talk on how AI is bad for content moderation. So, you know, there's still issues. The same general paradigms apply as far as where this detection takes place. Using similar cryptographic techniques, you could have this happen obliviously on the platform, where the platform is able to learn positive, like things in the positive class, things that the AI says, yes, I think this is a match, but not learn anything about negatives. Again, you could have a similar thing where the platform does the action, but the result is pushed to the receiver. And again, you could try to just put this entire thing on the client side. This is sort of the thing that I think of when I think of client-side scanning. I will say that some people use the word client-side scanning to mean everything that I've already talked about, because every single thing that I have mentioned so far requires sort of positive action on the client's part. So not really shown in this picture is the sender needs to send additional cryptographic information in order to allow this to work. It's not just something the platform can do with the standard end-to-end encryption system. There are actually surprisingly many machine learning content moderation in end-to-end encryption works. I kind of went into this literature search expecting that there weren't really any, and there actually were some, including Google spam protection, which is a spam, like an anti-spam measure included in Android messages, including end-to-end encrypted Android messages, that detects spam. And I think even the people that would fight me on whether or not malware should count as content moderation, I think even they would agree that spam should count as content moderation. So it's there. But I will also point out that every single one of these systems notifies only the client and does not notify the server. The only exception is this Google spam protection one. It does not reveal any content to the Google servers, but it does reveal the allegedly spamming phone number to Google. But all the rest of these do not. I'll also notice, so the Apple one here is a different Apple product actually than the one I was talking about before, although it was released at the same time. And I'll also point out that not a whole lot is known about the sort of efficacy of the industry proposals here. So that not reported number for Google and Apple is still not reported as far as I can tell. And again, I'm happy to talk about any of these. Also on this list of machine learning-based approaches to content moderation, and in this case CSAM, in end-to-end encryption, is this UK Safety Tech Challenge. This was a program that's been running for about the last year in the UK, where the UK Home Office ran a challenge, gave some money to some companies to try to develop tools for detecting CSAM under end-to-end encryption. Most of those companies built some kind of client-side scanner. One of them built a server-side matching system. But I guess suffice it to say that it turns out that the problems of end-to-end encryption in content moderation are probably not going to be solved in like 9 months with a quick tech challenge. And I'll tell you more about that after the talk, I guess. Okay, we know about matchlists, we know about machine learning. So what about human moderation? There should be some opportunities for human moderation here, and I want to break this up into 3 types. There's sort of the industrial Facebook style, large army of employee or contractor moderators. This is not really applicable as a first line option in end-to-end encryption because the whole point is you don't have random people from the platform looking at your information. So I won't be focusing on it here. But you could have community moderation or user reporting. So by community moderation, I mean there is somebody in the community, either like the group, or whether that's a Facebook group or a Reddit group or a Discord chat or something like that. And in the context of end-to-end encryption, maybe we trust this person to have some kind of additional key powers. So usually they have some kind of additional powers, like to rate limit people or ban people or something like that. So maybe we're okay giving them an extra key. They may use some kind of automated tools in addition to just manually reviewing everything. So it's pretty common for like Reddit or Discord moderators to use things that will automatically stop large volumes of content being posted, so spam, or just people using slurs or things like that. I guess the third way in which community moderation might happen is if there is some kind of content on which the community moderator isn't sure what the right approach is, they might report it to the platform. And that looks a whole lot like just normal user reporting, which is something we all know and love, where a receiver will take some content that is problematic for some way and just report it to the content or to the platform. There is a whole lot of focus on user reporting in the cryptography literature, and the main focus is on this thing called message franking, which is a authentication mechanism to ensure that user reports are legitimate. So they have these 3 properties. One, it's basically hard for a receiver to forge a report. So if, like, I thought Joan, if I just didn't like Joan, we don't want me to be able to frame Joan for sending a message that Joan didn't actually send me. Another property that this has is sender binding, where if I'm sending nasty messages, it's hard for me to, I shouldn't be able to like evade the scheme and somehow not get caught sending bad messages. But then it still retains this property that, I'll skip that, it's too complicated for this amount of time. There is a whole robust line of works on message franking in the cryptography literature. It goes back, to 2016, which is ancient history as far as this stuff is concerned. And I believe one of them is deployed at scale in WhatsApp. So that's, thing that has been there for quite some time. Then there's sort of a different question of, well, what do we actually want to reveal when we make a user report? These other works, rather than just having me report the message, maybe when I report the message, if it's been forwarded many times, I can it'll reveal the original sender of the message rather than the forwarder. And these were mostly designed to combat mis and disinformation, although I don't believe any of them are actually deployed. Okay, so there was my whirlwind tour of cryptographic techniques in content moderation. It goes without saying that none of these is a perfect solution. In the standard setting, most of these are used sort of in combination. In cryptography, these mostly use very different technical tools. So there's not really a whole lot of effort in trying to combine these right now. I want to focus on a couple of issues. One, matchlists they're just hard to use. Like, it's just too easy to get around them. AI, again, like I said, if I'd been doing this 3 years ago, every person here would have had a horror story about AI and content moderation. And it's definitely not the only thing, the only piece of the puzzle. Every, issue with human moderation is definitely a problem. First of all, we can't really use industrial human moderation in exactly the same way that, for example, Facebook uses it. I'm usually for things like more community moderation, more user reporting, less top-down, more bottom-up. I'm for that, but I do admit it has its own problems. Community moderators at the end are just like random users that we think are trustworthy. User reports are notorious for sort of being used to, you can like mass report somebody if you don't like them, and it'll just, drive them off the platform. All sorts of problems, and this is all even without encryption. But I do want to focus on two lessons from the end-to-end encrypted setting that I think can be brought out to the non-end-to-end encrypted setting. One is that we've been talking about, here's this whole laundry list of things you might use or things you might want to moderate, but actually these fall under two very distinct goals. One is protecting users from other users, and one is detecting bad behavior among groups of users. So here's what I mean. Something like harassment or malware or spam is like something that the receiving user doesn't want. And in principle, you could have that user just, report it or something. And the reasons not to do that are like, we don't want to make people just hit the that spam button every time they get spam. So we kind of want to do some kind of proactive detection of it. But in principle, it's there, there's at least one honest user in the loop, which matters in cryptography. And then there's this other setting of we want to detect bad behavior where we don't necessarily have an honest person in the loop. So this is your CSAM pictures or other pornography or extremism, but it's not all like the big scary stuff. It's also like intellectual property violations or people conducting sales on a platform where there's not supposed to be sales. So first of all, because you don't have an honest user in the loop, this basically limits the potential threat models for your ability to detect them. So I'm going to show you what I think is like the problem with perceptual hash matching on steroids. So the real issue at the end of the day is that for when you're detecting this like second problem, this collusion, you're relying on the sender inputting their honest input. So if we didn't have perceptual hash functions, right, the sender just inputs some image, and maybe the platform can detect it if it's an exact match with that image, and that would work. But we do have perceptual hash functions, so people do stuff like add a little pixel, and then all of a sudden the platform can't detect it. So the platform says, okay, well, I'm going to use perceptual hash functions, so I'll be able to detect it even if you slightly change the image. And if you follow this process all the way to the bottom, it is totally possible for the sender to just, like, out of band, encrypt the thing they want to send it via the platform, and then send it to the receiver who will decrypt it out of band. And there is no, technology on Earth that would be able to detect this, or else all our encryption schemes are broken. The perceptual hash function problem, I think, it's like it's a cat and mouse problem, and maybe clients aren't good enough to like roll their own encryption out of band. Certainly they could be doing this now, and they aren't. But at least theoretically speaking, at some point you're relying on some kind of assumption on the sender's behavior. Okay, I just said a lot of stuff. I'm going to end on hopefully a positive note on all of the fancy research that there is still to do in this space. I think there are so many opportunities for research in cryptography on the transparency side of content moderation. So like all those problems that Gavin was talking about with the GIF-CT, probably at least half of them could have some kind of cryptographic help for verification. So rather than privacy, focusing on verification. I also think there's still a lot of sort of standard content moderation research to be done, which you all will tell us about over the next day and a half. Just to drive this point home, there's these Clara Principles for content moderation, and without even thinking about it, like half of these at least have obvious roles that cryptography could help play in the transparency side, in the evaluation side, in making sure that appeal has some kind of verifiable records and making sure that we have cryptographically verified aggregate numbers revealed and that kind of thing. So I'm going to leave it there. I guess for cryptographers, my takeaway is there's already more end-to-end encrypted content moderation than like I realized and that I think most people realized. And I think there's a really important role that we need to play in making sure that these things are cryptographically transparent and cryptographically, there are options for improving systems even under end-to-end encryption. I think the, American view tends to be that like, oh, well, we don't really have any content moderation in end-to-end encryption. I think the stuff we just saw this morning makes it clear that Europe definitely does not feel that way. And so I think it'll, going forward, there's sort of a limited amount of time we have to sort of make sure privacy and transparency remain strong goals. If you're a social scientist or someone from industry, I would love to explore this distinction between these two sort of things we do content moderation for more. I haven't really seen anybody talking about this a whole lot. And I think, we're still, despite the fact that we've been talking about content moderation for a decade now or more, it still sort of feels like we have only very rudimentary tools for dealing with it, especially those that are compatible with end-to-end encryption. And if you're a policymaker, I would love to talk your ear off about why I think it's really important to make sure that if you're going to allow some kind of modification to end-to-end encryption to detect something that we think is bad, I think it's extremely important that you have a legal restriction on exactly how far that breach into end-to-end encryption is allowed to go. And past that, you want to increase friction to make sure that you don't have terrible scope creep into just removing encryption altogether. So thank you very much. Again, shameless plug for Anane's poster tomorrow. And a second shameless plug that I am going to be on the computer science academic job market next cycle. So if your institutions are hiring computer scientists and cryptographers who like thinking about this, please let me know. Thank you. I know I went super fast. I apologize.
So I want to ask you just about an expansion on the dichotomy between protecting users and preventing bad behavior. Because generally, I think of that as the attitude of the receiver towards the content that they're getting. The protecting users' motivation, the receiver doesn't want to see this. The preventing bad behavior problem, the receiver does. And I'm wondering if you had any observations about the asymmetry between senders and receivers as clients as you looked at all of these different moderation mechanisms in very different technical contexts.
That is a great question. So the first thing I want to say is I don't think this is a complete dichotomy. So you can think of something like misinformation that's sort of in the middle where yes, allegedly receivers don't want to receive misinformation, but in practice, most of them do receive it and, spread it. And, who knows what's even true anyways? There's all those philosophical questions also. But it's a good point. I think as I've been thinking about it, it is definitely mostly a distinction on whether receivers want it or not. I guess also this paradigm, also applies in situations where the senders are the receivers. So if I'm using like cloud storage, I am both the sender and the receiver. Presumably I want the things that I'm putting up, that kind of thing. I can't think offhand of an example where the sender doesn't, I guess maybe like a right to be forgotten sort of example where a sender, an original sender of information now says, no, I actually don't want that to be sent anymore, but receivers still want to receive it. You could maybe also say like non-consensual intimate imagery would also fall into that category of like somebody who sent something originally, but then says, no, wait, no, that's mine and I want it off this platform. Not sure whether that, fits into in that case, maybe there's still, as far as cryptography goes, maybe there's still a way to have that sender that used to send something, but now doesn't want that thing sent. Like, I'm not sure technically which that would fall into, but good question.
Yeah, but the connection to that other notion of privacy opens up a whole other interesting set of policy problems and research questions.
True, definitely agree.
Thanks, Sarah. That was great. My question is really just an invitation for you to kind of elaborate a little on where you see the kind of strategic work going forward in terms of the overlap with the Santa Clara Principles on transparency. I thought that was great, and but you got to it and kind of moved on really quickly. And if you can just give me like a little bit more on where you see the work that you're doing on at the intersection of cryptography and end-to-end encryption with transparency and the Santa Clara Principles going forward, that'd be great. Thanks.
Yeah, happy to talk about that. So one thing is, I think the introduction of an additional goal of privacy already changes something. Whether that's a new principle that should be added and we should figure out exactly what that principle is. I think, so first of all, there's the work of, adding new principles for these new goals that we're trying to do. Second of all, again, sort of there's this question of, if you're doing a hash set, who controls that hash set? Where, who is sort of responsible for maintaining that? How can you have trust in those people? Well, again, you can see our poster for this, but, cryptography gets you maybe, 25% of the way to having more verifiability, more trust in these, people that need to be, or not people, but these systems that need to be audited and this sort of thing. So I think there is a important role for cryptography to play in providing some partial technical guarantees on, again, what the transparency properties are, on all that kind of thing. I don't think it gets you all the way there. And you certainly still need to have a lot of sort of standard transparency mechanisms in place as well.
So Gavin ceded one of my questions to you, and so I'm going to bring it back now that you're here. I think, as you discussed, there's all sorts of things that can be done to make hash functions collision resistant when you don't want them to collide. But in terms of collision evasion, I don't know the details of these perceptual hash functions, but I suspect that you can develop some software that goes around them pretty straightforwardly for any particular perceptual hash function. And I wonder if you've thought about what the sort of likely future is in terms of, well, you will have to have enough energy to go and get that software if you want to post your banned content, but you won't need to be very technical. And so I wonder just how much friction this kind of approach is going to introduce in the system, or whether it's going to be, I don't know, my students from Iran they just turn on the VPN when they want to go around the censorship, right? And that's sort of widespread. So what's it going to be like in terms of these hash lists?
Yeah, great question. I'll be honest and say I think that hash lists in general are pretty evadable. I think any perceptual hash function you design, once it becomes, even if it doesn't become public, I think once it's been there for a little bit, people will reverse engineer it and find a way around it. I would be more negative on hash lists if the alternatives weren't things like, we'll just use a classifier then, which will have actually some of the same problems, but it'll be a little bit harder at least. And so I guess I see perceptual hash functions and hash lists as sort of a necessary but flawed part of the content moderation ecosystem. And I think, again, like you said, there will be software that will get around pretty much any one of these. I guess I like quoting this locked door fallacy, where if you have two doors to a building and you lock one of them, it still reduces bike theft by like 40% or something, even if the other door is still unlocked. So I guess I think there's still a role for them to play, even though there will always be a way around them.
Just a quick follow-up to that, because I was going to ask about what you mean by cryptographically transparent, and does it relate to this issue of sort of gaming and getting around?
Yeah, so most of what I mean by cryptographically transparent is if the platform makes a promise, like we moderated, 1,000 images under CSAM this year, you have some way of verifying that in a mathematical sense. So a lot of these proposals are very much in their infancy. A lot of them will involve, every time the platform makes some moderation decision, it also must go and interact with this blockchain, unfortunately, to go and, have there be some record that must be there as a result of it having taken that action. So that's what I mean mostly is a way to, if the platform says it did something, you can have some evidence that that is true, even as a non-auditor, just random member of the public.
Okay, great. Thank you again, Sarah.
Thanks.